I'm going to show you how to lay out a basic surface design. So because I went to school before computers were prevalent, I learned how to do a lot of these things in art college. So those of you who went to architecture, interior design, graphic design school, then you would probably have some experience with this. If you did not, then you may find this video helpful. So I'm starting with an 11 by 14 sheet of Bristol paper, and I'm also working on a 24 by 36 rubber mat. These are sometimes called self-healing mats or cutting mats. I love working on these because it just has a really smooth surface. So if you're lucky enough to have a mat like this, go ahead and line your paper up exactly with the grid, and I'm going to secure it in place with artist tape. It's important to use artist tape. It looks similar to masking tape, but it's actually very different. It's smooth, and it's also a little thicker, and it doesn't have as much tackiness to it. So when I remove this tape later from my paper, it's not going to rip off the surface of the paper. In fact, sometimes it's even reusable a few times. So that's the first step. Now, if I wanted to, I could actually work. If I wanted to lay out a 1-inch grid, I could actually just align it with the lines on my, with the increments on my cutting mat in both directions, and that would be quite accurate. But assuming you don't have a cutting mat and you're just going to be working on a smooth surface, then go ahead and tape your paper to the smooth surface. It could be granite, glass, a wood desk, a piece of plastic, whatever. So we're going to use 8 by 8 as our standard layout size. So I'm going to go ahead and find the center of this paper. It's 7 inches. And I'm going to measure out this way, 4 inches in each direction. Now, you could also just do the math and say it's 14 inches minus 8, so that, and then divide by 2. That leaves 6, and then divide by 2 is 3 and 3. But it is helpful to find the center of the paper. So I'm going to go ahead and measure that. And notice that I'm using a mechanical pencil. This has a nice fine point. If you don't have that available, you can use a hard pencil. A 2H is what I suggest. If you find that your pencil has 2B, that's going to be too soft for drafting. It's excellent for sketching on paper, but it's too soft for drafting. It's going to give you thick lines, and they're going to be smudgy. So in this direction, I'm drawing my lines, but I'm also at the same time measuring. So it's an 8-inch square, so that leaves 3 inches, 1.5 inches, once divided by 2. So I'm going to do 1.5 inches in this direction. And I'm going to connect all the lines. Okay, so now I have a nice 8-inch square. I'm also going to give myself the center line. Another thing that you can do, once you have that line, you can actually tape your ruler in place. Actually, let's go ahead and make our marks. Let's say, for example, I want to do a 1-inch stripe. So I'm going to, or any design that's going to be spaced in 1-inch increments. So 8 divided by 1 inch, that's going to give us 8 sections. So what I can do is go ahead and tape my ruler just exactly along the edge. And again, I'm going to secure it with my artist tape. Next, what I'm going to do is get out my triangle. So it doesn't matter which triangle you use, whether it's the 45 degree or the 30-60. So I'm going to use my ruler as though it were a parallel rule on a drafting table. Since I know most people are not going to have those these days, I'm going to actually just rest my triangle against the edge, and then lining it up with my tick marks, I'm going to use it to draw perpendicular lines. So this is going to give me a really, really nice, straight, accurate grid. Now I can flip it this way, so my tape's getting in the way. Okay, so that's going to give me really nice square perpendicular lines. I could go in and divide this even further. Let's say you're doing a plaid or something like that. Then you would go in and actually mark all the smaller lines. Let's just show a demo. I have a second ruler here. I'm going to divide this 1 inch increment into 1/4 inch marks. And then this one I'm going to do in, let's say, we'll do 1/4, and then we'll do 2/8, and then we'll do 1/4 and 2/8. So again, using my triangle and my ruler, I'm going to mark off these lines. So if you're using gouache or watercolor for your paint, then refer to my ruling pen demo, my ruling pen video, and you'll see how I use the ruling pen to draw those lines in. Now, if I needed to go this other direction, I could simply remove this ruler and I could tape it this direction and then use the triangle this way to mark my lines. I could also just make 2 marks if you wanted to do it that way. It's a little riskier, but for example, I can go in here and do my 1 inch marks. And then I could mark it again over here and then use the ruler to connect them. Or I could tape this in place. Being careful to line it up as perfectly as possible and make sure it's very secure so it's not going to move. Once I put some pressure on it, I'm going to go ahead and put 2 pieces of tape. And so here I can use my ruler this way. So there I go with my here is my 1 inch grid. And I can break this down as much as I need to, whether I'm doing stripes or I'm doing plaids or wovens or some other design. Now let's just say you're doing a polka dot design. Then you're still going to want to lay out a grid like this. And then at that point, you're going to want to bring in your circle templates. So I have a circle template here. So I would work out a little sketch, a thumbnail sketch in advance, but right now I have 8 1 inch squares in each direction, correct? So to do a polka dot, I'm going to go do something basic like I'll go with a 1 inch polka dot. So what I'm going to do is use my lines as my horizontal and vertical alignments. And so working with the center points of the circle, line up the 2 center points, the verticals, and then also line up the horizontal, and that will hold it in place very securely. And then I can just very lightly trace in my dot. And so I could, for example, go across this whole piece. And then if I wanted to do a half drop, I can work on the alternating spot. Now, when you do a surface design, imagine this 8-inch square is going to repeat again. So anything that happens, anything that bleeds out on the left side must match up on the right side. So therefore, in order for this polka dot half drop to work, I actually need to put another dot here. And then I need to put another dot in the matching spot on the right. Now, some people will tell you to actually have just a half a dot on each side, but I like to go ahead and draw as well as paint the element on both sides. And this comes in handy not just for geometrics, but say you're doing a floral or a paisley or some other type of hand-painted design. You don't want to have to touch up. If you just paint a half of a flower here and a half a flower here, when you go to scan that in, you're going to have to touch up that whole seam. It's better to go ahead and paint the whole element. And that way, once you put it together in Photoshop, you can actually choose this dot or this dot and overlap them on the computer, and that will make it repeat, but it'll save you a lot of retouching time to not have to touch up those seams. So I'm going to just go ahead and do the rest of this layout. So there's my half drop polka dot pattern. Had I drawn my lines longer, I wouldn't have had to flip this around. It's just that I didn't have long enough lines, so I had to flip my circle template around. So just note in the future to go ahead and draw your lines about an inch past your 8-inch square. So now that I have my pencil layout done, I'm going to now fill in my design. And since I'm just working in black and white for this demo, I'm going to go ahead and use Sharpie markers. I'm going to use a extra fine point for my outline, and then I'm going to use a thicker one for my fill. Now that I have everything outlined in black, I'm going to go through and fill it in. I think this is going to take too long to fill in with markers, so I'm actually going to switch to drawing ink. So I have some drawing ink here. I'm going to put a little bit into my paint palette, and then I'm going to consider a couple different type brushes. I'm going to start with a thicker brush so I can quickly fill in the centers, and then I can always go around the edges with a thin brush. Just depending on your comfort level with brushes, I think it's something really nice to get comfortable with, because you'll find that you may not necessarily hand paint all your geometrics, but having hand painted art in your surface designs is quite valued in the field, and we don't really want everything to look perfect like it's done on a computer. So having a good feel for working with brushes is a good thing. Now, you don't have to have the paper taped at this point. In fact, after I fill in the centers, I'm going to remove the tape, and then I'll use the the thin brush to go around the edges. That will just be quicker. If you find yourself with elements that are in the middle and you'd have to reach over areas that you've already painted, get a piece of tracing paper. I took a piece of 11 by 14 and I cut it in half, and I'm going to use this as a shield. Now I could have started in the middle, and that maybe have been more logical. But even if you start in the middle, you don't want to put your hand directly on the paper where you're going within your image area, because even your hand could leave oil on the paper and then you won't be able to, it wouldn't take paint later. And then I'm going to allow that to dry. And while that's drying, I'm going to get my white gouache paint ready. So working with white gouache paint, I'm just going to dab a little bit out at full strength onto my artist palette. And I've gotten a clean brush. I don't want to use the same brushes that I've been using with ink. I pulled out a few different sizes because I wasn't quite sure what would work the best. And with this full strength, I'm just going to dab it just slightly over top of my mistake. And there you go. Because if I scan this in, you're not going to see that. I could also go in and touch up a few of my little imperfections. But in some ways, this is what makes it look hand done. I mean, if we wanted it to be perfect, we would draw this on the computer. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now, once this is all dry, then you're going to want to use a vinyl eraser. Mine is quite well worn out. Don't use the orange or pink erasers like we used to use in elementary school. Use this white vinyl because it will not leave any marks on your paper. It leaves very little residue. And it's made specifically for artists, but this is still a little wet, so I'm not going to go through and do the whole thing right now. You also want to keep your line around the outside. So what I might do is draw that in darker and then do all the interior lines and markings and get rid of all those. So anyway, that's the end of this first part.